So you're saying border as a verb,
very much so.
like
Firstly,
to border, to make borders.
or yeah, to unmake borders.
Huh, right. By bordering less, you're
Yeah.
ah. Well, speaking of plays on words, wordplay, the structure of the book is roots, part one is ROOTS, and then second part is roots, as in a route, as in a direction, as in a road. Um, I wonder about the seeds for that, and I guess maybe just the book in general. And then also I get a lot here. So I guess the first one is this are these thematically linked short stories? Are these chapters? Like, how did you describe the book, like, to the publisher and all that?
I certainly call it a novel, and very stubbornly so, coming to the last question. At the same time, it's also challenging, right? The ideas of sort of the mainstream novel.
Hmm.
And I want to write about it. I've spoken about it in interviews, like this idea of a novel being driven by continuity, right? This idea of
Right.
building a novel, the world of a novel being akin to a vivid, continuous dream. That's sort of the
Hmm.
one by John Gardner.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
And those imply like ideas of continuity, but also cause and effect and
Hmm.
linearity. That's sort of so big to many ideas, maybe in the mainstream workshop, but continuity, wholeness. I wanted to challenge all those ideas of continuity and wholeness, first of all, because these are recent ideas in
Hmm.
history when it comes to the novel itself, including the Western novel. Um,
Right.
and it's associated often with the rise of and popularity of realism, so almost like 18th, 19th century. Before that, I don't think we were that driven by the idea of one or a few protagonists, or maybe even character driven fiction. It might
Hmm.
be a recent invention from what I know, at
Yeah.
least. It's a recent invention in literary fiction. And there are writers who've written about this, writers of color, and it does not reflect so many of our legacies. And that's why the book opens with a quote by Edouard Glissant, Afro-Caribbean writer, poet, thinker, who tells that whenever, he's talking about societies or communities that were colonized and how so much of our storytelling did not obey the ideas of continuity. In fact, it was very stubbornly and consciously marked by ideas of
Hmm.
discontinuity, eruption, kind of fragments,
Yeah.
etc. So I built on that, but that made sense once again. Like, so how did I describe when I was kind of pitching?
Yeah.
I would call it a fragmented novel, a hybrid novel, an
Hmm.
experimental novel. These are some of the words I used. If I had to describe it to the mainstream, like sort of a mainstream audience who understands novel, through the tradition of the realist novel, I would say it's a novel in short fiction.
Okay.
I would not call it a novel in vignettes. I would not call it a novel in short stories.
Hmm.
Even if, like you, I think the short fiction is my favorite form too.
Hmm.
But I say short fiction over short story because story is a very specific kind of a form
Uh-huh.
of short story.
Sure.
And there are vignettes in the book. There are chapters that are vignettes in the book. There are chapters that are short stories in the book. And then there are chapters in the book that are neither. They're sort of hybrid connectors. A
Mm-hmm.
couple, something like Blue and Brown, if you remember, it's
Yeah.
from the perspective of a refugee, that could be interpreted as a prose poem. So it's short. It's a short narrative, but I would not call it a short story.
Mm. Do you
Um,
the difference short fiction and short story, like, do you feel like short story, like, has a connotation of like an end and like a neat wrapped up in a box type of thing, and short fiction is more, because a lot of the vignettes or short fiction that you have in here, a lot of it just makes you think, which all the great fiction does. It makes you think as you leave it. Like, you kind of fill in the gaps of maybe what happens down the road,
right.
you know?
Right. And short stories, I think we're on the same page with that, that they do have subtler endings. They don't have to give it all,
Yeah.
upfront to the reader. They do have that. With a sense of movement, like for instance, vignette and short story. These are two different types of short fiction.
Mm-hmm.
Vignette may not have the same sense of movement that
Right.
a short story has, if that makes
Mm-hmm.
any sense.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And so much is felt intuitively, I feel, in writing. And then short story, the way I understand, and I hesitate to call it a short story, is, of course, 1001 Nights, if we go back to our earlier traditions,
Okay.
right, of the non-West. These were books made of short stories, connected short stories, but they were understood very differently, once again, than the realist or the modern short story in a more Western tradition, right? I'm thinking, I don't know, like short stories of Raymond Carver or John Cheever,
Okay.
or Grace Paley. Those, they still had some kind of wholeness,
Wholeness, yes.
right? They had some sense of wholeness in a way that short stories of the 1001 Nights may not have, or even aspire to. They were driven by their own aesthetic assumptions. And that's why I hesitate to call it short stories, because I feel in the United States, especially with the rise of the workshop culture everywhere,
Right.
short stories understood more through the lens of the kind of stories that we associate with Updike or Cheever or Grace Paley, etc.
Yeah. Sorry, I had a brief flashback to an ugly workshop experience. I'm okay. I'm over it now. No, I'm just kidding. Those were like crucibles, right? They were formative. They could be pretty ugly, but they could also be very helpful. In the end, they were helpful.
Agreed.
I think of like this the story 912, which doesn't seem to be incredibly like explicitly linked to a lot of the other parts of the book, but I really enjoyed it. And I can't quite put my finger on why I did, but it wasn't 912 as in September 12th, 2011. It was like what, maybe 2016, 2017. One, it put, I mean, it seems so simple, but like in Chile, for example, 9/11 means something different. They had like, there was like a massacre of sorts, right? And the terrorist attack in India, this idea that Americans were not the only ones, right? But I guess I'm just kind of wondering, like that particular story, 912, it's kind of like the boys, Muslims, and they're just kind of talking about life and about how they're treated and about social political like fallout, I guess. What is that? What did you feel like that story accomplished, or is accomplished not even the right word, because it's there and you're not trying to wrap things up in a whole way? Sorry, that's a rambling question.
No, I appreciate it. First of all, I think those are like four friends talking in the story at a bar,
Right.
at a makeshift bar, and they're it's interreligious friendship. We have a
Okay.
Christian guy, we have a Hindu guy, we have a Muslim guy,
Yeah.
and then the fourth one I forget, but it's basically Hindu, Muslims, Christians talking among themselves. And one of the characters is actually the Nepali maid's boyfriend. So there's a story in the
Yes,
book,
yes, 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 yes.
that's told from a Nepali maid's perspective. And why? What does it accomplish? So as I see it, once again, I mean, people have interpreted, and that's a fair interpretation, that Borderless is a story of the call center agent with whose story the novel begins. Dia
Right.
Mittal, it's Dia's story.
Right.
And that's a fair interpretation, but Dia's story is so interweaved in the book with stories of
Yes.
different characters that kind of pass through her life in different ways, right? It kind of creates a web. So Dia's friends at some point in the novel are getting married in Mumbai. And that story is being told from a Nepali maid's perspective, who's another migrant character. And then her boyfriend is telling sort of the story of of the boys talking in 912. So it was a way for me to tell Dia's story, but interweave her story with a South Asian migrant community with characters from across the world.
Yes.
That's what it accomplishes, that web.
The first, thank you for that. That makes a lot of sense. The first story is Help Me Help You. You referred to like the call center. Diaz, I mean, she's an actress, right? I mean, she's performing. They're given a script. They're given certain ththings they have to do. You built the tension so well in that story. All right. What are they called? Fatal errors, right? You get a certain amount of fatal errors, and she will not be promoted. She wants to go to Manila, which is kind of like the next step, and much better money and things like that. So she has to take a racist call from Vicky, and you just the way you build the tensions, like the time is running out, like they're supposed to stay under, I think, what, 15 minutes maybe.
Yeah, yeah. Time is running out for sure. I don't remember the exact
Yeah. No,
number.
and it was just like, oh my gosh. And you just when, sorry to spoil a little bit, but when the time does run out, you're just like, you feel for her so much. You just build up the tension so well. So you could always get into suspense and thrillers and stuff too,
I
right?
never knew I had it in me. Thank you for saying that.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's this idea of like, she takes like just racist vitriol and this idea of like, okay, the customer is always right and those type of things, and just that everyone has to make a paycheck, everyone has to earn a paycheck, and even her boss, and you feel so horrible for the things she has to take. I believe this is the second story, which is Lady Special. And that's another cool one. I want to say there's maybe three if you include 9/12, and there's one with like where the ladies get together for like the mimosa every Sunday. But it's just so cool. It's just like just friends getting together. In this case, they're on the train. It's hectic. It's kind of tongue in cheek, right? Calling it like the ladies night special train. And one of the friends is talking about like ideas of American productivity, right? It's kind of like an American word. Sorry, I have this stupid motion sensor. There we go. But just like, their daily lives. The one woman is, cutting carrots, so she hasn't prepared for when she gets home. And it's just really cool, like having the city as a character as well. Right. What did you see in that story, Lady Special, and especially writing in first person with we and I? What were you trying to get across there?
So many things in that chapter, actually.
Yeah.
We are talking about story, right? Like we were talking about short fiction, different forms of short fiction.
Mm-hmm.
Vignette, a short story. And if you think about that chapter, it's more than a vignette, but it's certainly not a short story. Because if you think about it, it's like characters chit-chatting,
Right.
being in many ways in that train, and that's it, that's the story, and which is not
Mm-hmm.
really a story if you think about it, right?
Mm.
But it does end with a reflection on Mumbai. Yeah, Mumbai as a character, I'm glad you caught that, and that is certainly an unconscious intention that I discovered in my own drafts. Okay, Mumbai is a character in this as well, but there's a reflection on archipelago. Mumbai is an archipelago city. It was a city originally of 7 islands.
Mm-hmm.
And the way the book is structured, the way I see it, it has a very archipelagic structure, right? These different
Oh,
islands
it's a good word.
connected.
Archipelagic. Did you make that word up? It sounds good. It's an adjective.
Archipelagic?
I
Oh,
like it.
I was a huge, I call myself an island girl because I grew up in Mumbai as well. I'm huge into the idea of archipelagos. I studied island literature, and Glisson, who
Yeah.
opens the book, he talks a lot about the Caribbean and archipelagos as ways of storytelling. So archipelagic has come up in my work very often, but yeah, I think I have a very personal attachment
It
to
sounds like
that.
it.
But LA, where we live, like Greater Los Angeles, to me, it's so different from New York, which is also an island city, New
Yes.
York City. But like I feel Greater Los Angeles is an archipelagic city. I mean, we have Westminster, we have in Orange County where I live, Santa Ana, right?
Yep.
Like one of the biggest Latino enclaves. Westminster, one of the biggest
Vietnamese, right?
Vietnamese enclaves. And then you have Cerritos and Little India. So we have like these different islands, so to speak, because of urban planning, the way they are kind of clustered. It's like an archipelagic city. So there is a whole meditation on archipelago in that. And one of the characters wonders with archipelago as a structure. Yeah. She says, who becomes the main character in this city, in the city guide, and who become the marginal characters? And I think it offers, it's kind of a meta moment or a meta.
Right, it is for sure.
On the book as well, like when things are an archipelago, how do you find the center and how do you find the margin? And that's sort of a reflection on the book structure. Lady Special also was one of the original titles of the book, Lady Special Homebound, because in many ways one can say the book is like a train of different compartments right? Different compartments with different
Yeah.
characters, and each one is trying to get home somehow.
Hmm.
So I felt like that metaphor made sense, and it's tongue-in-cheek, lady
Sure.
special, but
Yes.
it's also very literal. There's literally a train in Mumbai called Lady Special as well. So like
Mm.
a train full of women trying to go home felt like a good metaphor in many.
Yes. Yes. Yeah, the ending is so powerful, and I'm sure you'll be complimented to be complimented and compared to like you talk about Imani Perry with like the academic, but also the personal. And this story is personal. It's not your first person story, but it's fictional. But like, I just thought it was so interesting how it ends with that history and like the bigger, the more meta or the more macro, right? When it's a lot of micro stories. And I love the plot device, I guess, where right, it was like the last images of this book that's turned so you can't see the front cover, and kind of like what something about what name was it in the ancient book, what name was used for these people. And just so cool. Like you can see the book, it's historical, but like we can't see the cover. That was so cool.
Yeah, yeah, and yeah, the idea of naming as we are talking, because
Naming.
Mumbai has had historic fights over its name, but it's the same with Borderless as well. When we
Yeah,
talk about fiction, what name would you
sure.
give this? Is it a novel? It's something I always sort of have to explain that as well. Is it short stories? Is it vignettes, or what is it? So that whole idea of naming with that as well, that is
Right.
not conscious.
I wouldn't say tension is the word, but there's definitely themes of tension, maybe in light ways, like Aziz, who's one of Dia's first boyfriends. He's Muslim, and we don't necessarily know that her father is against that, but she's like, I'm not sure. That I'm kind of gonna deal with that later, and they don't end up staying together for very long. And I don't think because of the religion, but it could be implied maybe that there was an expectation, maybe that would be something down the road. Um, but financial fortunes, of course, is definitely one of the themes. Sorry, I'm in a motion sensor room and I keep moving and nothing's happening. um, but just like the chemo that needs to be done for, is it pronounced Kishan? Kishan?
Yeah, Kishan.
Kishan,
Mhm.
right? And you talked about the Nepali narrator, and she is there's of course class divisions for sure. And I mean, she is put down, she is yelled at, she is made to feel like she's about 1 inch tall, right? And they have, there's kind of like those tongue-in-cheek nicknames for Sweetie Die and Madame, right? And ideas of like, for sure. You talked earlier about that the baby shower, right? Is it Ronnie is the
Yeah.
cousin?
Yeah.
And so, they get together, and Ronnie, who seems kind of like bohemian, like, nose ring, kind of like chill or whatever. And she just, again, just lambastes the waiter. The food's not, it's too cold, this and that. So, there are clearly class divisions. There are people who don't know anything other than an air conditioned office or an air conditioned house. And then there are people who have to, scrimp and save, and like you talked about, live in gritty areas, and always having to save money and look for the next job. And you know, with Dia, like you talk about, right? She comes from maybe middle class or lower middle class, but she doesn't have a father. She doesn't have an inheritance, and everything she does is think, okay, how am I going to take care of my mom and all those types of things, right? So I wonder about, like, I guess, economic disparity. Like, do you was that something that was on your mind consciously to show those differences, to show those clashes, whether they're loud ones or quiet ones?
To be honest, no, not at all. But I did realize, like when we're writing like the early stages, we never like, I mean, I'm not writing consciously, like, okay, I'm going to write
Hmm.
around this theme. We're just following certain voices, certain
Right.
images. But in the later stages of writing, when I came back kind of wearing the critic's hat, I was like, whoa, I think class is a pretty important theme in this book, class. So I discovered actually in later stages of rereading my own work that class is a pretty important one. And I'm
Yeah.
discovering even now on my path as a writer, not just with fiction, but with nonfiction, that class comes up pretty often.
Hmm.
And which makes sense because migration comes up very consciously. Migration, I feel, comes up
Right.
consciously in my work because I'm very aware of how much it informs me as a person. and my life as well. But with migration, right, moving from one of the parts of the world that's kind of seen as a poster child for global poverty to one of the richest economies in the world, it's hard. It's hard not to notice. And I didn't come from a privileged background in that world, in the third world. So
Right.
now with education that sort of gave this upward mobility and a comfortable middle class, it's hard not to see those differences. So the whole idea of class as it is experienced through the lens of geography, maybe, or the so-called first world
Sure.
versus the third world, those things come up a lot in my writing as well.
No doubt about it. And with that, I mean, there's so many, I guess, more subtleties, right? Like where, Dia's mom's basically saying like, hey, get a stable job. And Dia had one for a while and was doing very well financially, but she ends up going into like art history, kind of some of the things you were talking about earlier, just like art history. Like, a lot of parents would be like, what is that? Like, you have this great job, you're making six figures. Like, what are you doing? But where somebody of upper class or higher class or whatever the term would be has more room to be, I'm gonna go travel for a year, right? I'm gonna take an unpaid internship. For others, it's like, what is that? Unpaid internship, right? And again, this idea of like excitement and passion over comfort. Dia definitely wanted to explore the world and was, like, what do I love? What do I love to do? There's a great comparison with like Nargis the bird, who's like made his own home.
Right.
Is the way this is written about, right? He's made his own home in the house and the apartment. But yeah, so just ideas of independence and stability. And there's a great quote. I'm being a big fan of like the Godfather and mafia type things. I think of Michael Corleone says, what about my future? My future. Right. And they said your father has plans for your future.
Right.
And the quote from I believe from Diaz, what about what I like?
Right.
Seems so basic, but kind of like an informal matchmaking. Is it pronounced Yash?
Yash. Yeah. Yash.
Yash is, he checks all the boxes. Right. And Dia's mom says, why not? And she doesn't have the chemistry, she doesn't have the passion, right? So with that, you talked about, there's a lot about home and the diaspora, of course. There's some great descriptions of a diverse Indian population, diverse diaspora, right? Mauritius, how would you pronounce the Mauritius, right, off the coast of Africa. Some who are second and third generation Indian American. You talked about the rural and the urban. Some who speak the language perfectly, some who don't. When Dia returns to India, to Bombay or to Mumbai, and she gets these questions like tourists would, what was that like for her? And maybe what was that like? I don't know if that's ever happened to you, like where you are, of Indian background, you're from there, you speak languages from there.
Right.
But they could tell she was a tourist or that she wasn't from there at the moment. I guess, what was that like to write about or to experience?
Yeah. I think it's both. I think it's a very classic diaspora moment, but it's also like a first generation diaspora moment,
Okay.
right? I mean, people like my husband who are also part of Indian diaspora, but who are born and raised here, they don't feel the need as much to go back to the motherland. They really, they identify themselves less maybe with the hyphen, more with American,
sure,
or Indian American. But people like us who, the first generation American, who has first half of our lives we associate with India and second half with America. We're really in that space of the hyphen, non-existent. I'm not for that idea of a hyphen, that we somehow like kind of. So it's a very classic moment of those like me, first generation Americans who go back home and who are then seen as tourists. Yeah. So of course I've experienced it, but I'm not the only one who've experienced. Like my friends, almost all of my friends who go back, as part of that diaspora who were raised there, you were experienced as a tourist. And why does this happen? I don't know. I don't know how to articulate that in language. Maybe I will someday as a writer. I wouldn't know how to articulate that yet. but it does happen. It's a very, so to me, yes, it was a personal moment, but it's a very communal. It's a very communal
Yes.
moment
Yes.
as well. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I mean, the great works are always very, very particular to their place, to their time, and also have universal points. And for sure, I mean, how many of us, all of us, can understand what it's like to be separated from maybe family members you were previously really close to. You used to, you grew up with that cousin, and life just, maybe there was no blow up, it just, life happened. So, when she goes back, when Dia goes back for this baby shower, it's like texting back, WhatsApp, of course, the classic, app, and for connection. And it's like, okay, cool, let's get together. Yeah, cool. And then, once she gets there, and once there are more specific things, or like, hey, can you come across the city? Radio silence, right? And a great quote in here is, quote, "No matter how close they were growing up in India, what stood between them, it occurred to her, were 7 years and a few oceans." There's a sadness there, right? Where it's just like not being able to fully get back what was there, that nostalgia.
Right, right. And you're right. I mean, it is a diasporic moment, but you're right. I think maybe all of us experience that, right? It happens with relationships. Like
Yeah.
one has that chemistry, so to speak, at some point, and then time passes, and then you're like,
Or
oh,
you have kids and you have no free time anymore, all the above, right?
that too.
Right. But it's not all doom and gloom. Like, there's a beautiful scene at the end of that story, chapter, where there's the way that I took it was, Ronnie and Dia were able to get out on the dance floor, and the family and friends, and no matter how much they fully speak the language or don't, how long they've been there, they're dancing. There's like this connection with like the ancestor, like they all have grandma in common. Right. And you use the word synergy a lot, and there's just this synergy of the dancing. And again, it's like, sounds cheesy, and you play it off, the way you write it is, not cheesy at all. It's very subtle, but just this idea of like, we all have this in common, we all have this person in common, and this is our family. The family is definitely defined in different ways throughout the book. How about with family, with like the men, like most of them for second and third generation, they go and they watch Lakers games, but they always spend time together. How did they find family, especially if maybe some of their families are more scattered?
And I think that too, to me, like all these moments that you're talking about, like the first one in Mumbai that takes place where, for instance, with the woman character, Dia, right?
Mm-hmm.
And she finds that she cannot relate to her family the same way. At the same time, there is this effortless relationship to them in
Yes.
dance
Yes.
that coexist, that kind of paradox in many ways coexist. And I feel it's kind of similar maybe when the boys, right, the male characters,
Mm-hmm.
they're hanging out at a bar, and it's like they feel a lot of kind of distance from their parents, but they find family in each other.
Right.
So you're right. I mean, the definition of family as we move along from different kinds of diaspora, from one to another, from one community to another, the definitions of family constantly keeps changing.
Mm-hmm.
um I wouldn't know to analyze that further. I
Yes.
felt like that was the whole point of showing, like, these things are not constant, and these paradoxes or oppositions can coexist.
Right. Yeah, the idea of coexisting, for sure. There are some beautiful, just like small moments where, along those same lines, Dia's husband is Vish, is that right?
Dia's husband is Neil
Neil,
Vicious.
excuse me, right.
Right.
Right. And so, so Neil and Dia, and so Dia has her family mostly back in Mumbai, not in Southern California. And Neil is, at a family member's party, or, baby shower or whatever, every other week, every other month, 3-4 times a month. And she's naturally jealous. She doesn't come out naturally, doesn't come out explicitly, but and she wants to go on this 1 year, their baby's 1 year, and they want to go to Hawaii. And of course he says, well, cool, I'll invite a couple of family members, and doesn't tell her. She's really upset. She wants some alone time. And then, but there's also just a beautiful moment where he speaks to her, where he, I think I'm getting two of the stories mixed up, but where they just have their moment where they're together amongst all the talking and jokes and Lakers game and this and that. And they just have like their connection. Am I mixing up two of the stories?
No, maybe not. What
Two
you're
chapters?
talking about is how that story ends, I think, when
Yes,
they're
I am.
driving and they have this moment of connection. Yeah. Yeah.
Definitely.
Yeah.
Definitely. As the book goes on, there are the characters get older. Dia, in the end, we talked about, you don't want to put an exact age on it, but she's, close to retirement age. She has grandkids, right? And there's this idea of, and please help me with, is it Haveli?
Yes.
This
Yeah.
idea, very significant, this idea of the Haveli that's been in the family for generations, and it's like, what do we do with this? It's got, for her as an artist, as an art historian, it's got beautiful architecture and art to it. It obviously has huge family significance, but it's like, okay, as the generations go on, they're further and further, not as connected, they're more disconnected. And the question of, does she sell it? She knows somebody who's going to buy it. That's kind of keeping in the family, but not really. And it's just, the whole story is just such a saga. I could see, the book is always better than the movie, always, except for like two occasions. But like, there's so many interesting characters, and like, I could see it being like a family saga. I could see it being, just concentrating on one character. But I just love the breadth of the book. How were you able to like write over so many years within the book, but yet keep some there is continuity in that we same characters. How were you able to do such disparate stories at times, but also make it revolve around the same type of characters? You're like, I don't know.
Yeah, no, I think speaking of time,
Alchemy.
maybe I know, right? Yeah, really. The book was written over a period of 17 years, which is like half my
Okay.
life.
Yeah.
Pretty much. So I think it allowed
Wait, you
me.
were 4 years old when you started the book? What the
Thank
heck?
you. You're so kind.
What a prodigy, man.
Okay, a little, if I'm honest, a little over half my life. Um, I think I was learning to be a writer with this book. I was giving myself more the permission to be a writer because I associated that with very gifted people that I did not associate myself with. And I think one of the good things about maybe being in that space, although the self-doubting was not a good thing, but being in that space was just kind of going where characters take you. And that's what I did with the book, sort of just going, exploring, and the time. 17 years kind of allows you, different stories can emerge in that time frame in a way maybe that a year of writing, at least from a debut writer, it may not produce the same breadth for many of us mortals. um, I don't know. And I think really, I wish I had like a very rationalized answer to this. I don't. I think over this period, I was just following these characters.
Yeah.
That said, in the last 2 years, once it got accepted for publication by an indie press, I did put on very strictly sort of the critics hat. And I had a vision already of what kind of a novel, what kind of a form I wanted the book to take. So archipelagic
Yes.
is a word I might use, fragmented. But then I think there was a conscious decision in those sort of last couple of years of how I can make these ties stronger. So that's when sort of connecting these different characters through that web and creating a web was important. So certain details will repeat, like a silk stole would repeat, the idea of roses in bloom would repeat. So structure was important to me, but I was trying to do structure in alternative ways. So I think just bringing back those details, like 9, 8, 12, we talked about it in the story with the Nepali maid that happened. I don't know originally if 9, 12, one of the characters was Nepali maid's boyfriend. Sure. At some point I had to make them, but then there is so much references to travel agents and like travel buses, and those moments then repeat themselves in those stories.
Okay, yeah.
Well.
Well, no, it's so interesting. I mean, it's like you lived along with these characters for all those years. Obviously we all change, and there's so many different experiences in our lives. And, for those years that you were writing you brought that to the page. It's just so cool to see it come to fruition like that. Obviously, we'd be remiss without talking about, there's obviously a lot about gender roles and misogyny, for sure. You have so many just quantity wise, you have so many strong female characters. And, you know, a logical person looks at something like, why are the women in whatever culture, whatever group, why are the women always the last ones to eat? Why are they why is their labor at home in the workplace? You know, I'm not saying anything fresh and original, but just logically speaking, like, yeah, okay, cool. Like, well, he's tired. You know, mom would always say I think about Dr. Neil. Well, mom's, he's tired. Well, so am I. Like, I have a job. I was stooped over my art for 8 hours or 10 hours or whatever. And so, you know, there's obviously a lot there. And we love how Diaz doesn't suffer fools, as they would say, right? She's not buying it, right? There's also Ricky, and remind me Ricky's relationship to Dia. Familial.
So Ricky is, it's once again in that web of relationships.
Yeah.
Ricky is Noor's sister-in-law, and Noor is Dia's one of best friends. Yeah, Dia and Noor are very close friends.
Right. And so, you know, she's one, you know, she's definitely outside the norm. She's not one who sticks to these traditional feminine roles. And that's a beautiful story where the father, an older 75-year-old man, and he just kind of looks back at his life and he rues his mistakes, but you feel for him because they're not mistakes out of malice. They're mistakes because he had to work major hours, you know, had to support his family and stuff. But he just kind of looks back and says, you know what, if the first time they started to, you know, maybe make jokes about, like, homophobic jokes about Ricky, or, you know, make fun of her because she's not a traditional, you know, female or whatever, he's like, I should have stopped it, or I should have been more proactive, right? But you feel for him because he is well-meaning, I think, right? And now he's going to be able to have a chance to write his story and get it out to the world. So I always love that meta thing, right, where he's writing a story within a chapter, within a book, right? And of course, a great way to end the book is it pronounced Kundalini? Kundalini. And his ideas of, you know, feminine energy. You talked about that a little before. You know, there's a quote, something about like, oh, so-and-so's, you know, he's born with a penis, you know, therefore he's exalted. And I just love this idea of an ancestor, a goddess, just kind of like an omniscient, not kind of an omniscient type character, just looking over all of it. And really just, and what a way to end the story. And the book does not end there, because I know you don't use these traditional forms, but I wonder why, you know, as far as structure, why that one to end it?
So there were two minds, the rational, right? The workshop mind said, you need to end this book on Dia's journey, the Hawaii chapter. And many, many who looked at the manuscript also said you need to end there. But then there's the non-rational mind.
I'm glad you didn't listen.
Yeah, me too. I love that last chapter, but like I said, it's the non-workshop mind, and there was this kind of fight in my head between the workshop mind and the non-workshop mind, and that voice was so insistent, and the voice was like, I need the last word here. And I was like, okay, now how do I make this happen? So I loved, and that was the easiest chapter to write.
Oh, wow.
Because I felt like I just downloaded. The voice was so insistent. And then I was like, okay, now how do I make the form work? Because this is not, you know, it's not the traditional form. And so that was the bigger question, not so much about retaining the chapter. That was like I wouldn't be allowed to finish the manuscript without it. That decision was taken for me somewhere else within me, but how to make it fit. And that's when I kind of started reflecting more on forms, but also with my desert ancestry, this whole idea of frame narratives. Framing is super important in our art, in our performing art, in our visual arts. We have a long tradition of very political theater and puppeteering, and framing is really important to that.
Okay.
So, and framing is really important to many of the South Asian, I mean, really any of the formerly colonized cultures, many of them oral storytelling, including actually, the West too, right? The Heptameron, the Decameron, the older traditions, they have like a strong tradition of frame narrative. So this was then sort of, I wanted to make it sort of a frame, because frame comes in the dances. India story, Haveli, the Charoka, the window, and
Mm,
artwork
yes, yes, yes,
is
yes.
looking. That's
Those
also
protruding, right?